First example I was, you know,
Ça va? Vous voyez
Oui,
bien?
vas-y.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Stephen. So the title of my talk is From Large Language Models to Cognitive Architectures. It's meant to imply some evolution from one to the other. The direction in my talk is going to be the opposite. As Stephen mentions, I'm not going to assume that the audience is familiar with the concept of cognitive architecture. So the first half of my talk will be going through a history and an introduction to the concept to try and ground it thoroughly. And then the second part of my talk will be reviewing a set of presentations that were given at the AAAI symposium that we organized last fall on the topic of integration of cognitive architectures and generative model to try and give a broad idea of the different ways in which those two concepts could be combined. So the concept of cognitive architecture really originated with a fairly famous talk that Alan Newell gave at Carnegie Mellon in the Carnegie Symposium of Cognition, where he reviewed the research that was going on at the time in cognitive science and computational modeling, and gave that talk called "You Cannot Play 20 Questions with Nature and Win." And he was objecting there to the primary approach that dominated psychology at the time, which was to divide the very general question of understanding the human mind and human cognition into narrower and narrower questions that could be addressed experimentally and computationally. But his point was that that divide and conquer approach was just a divide approach, and there was no path there to put the successes that were achieved at the leaves of the tree, if you will, back to the root. So what he suggested there was the development of computer models that could do complex tasks in their entirety, do all the stages of the task, and also have a general approach to cognition that wouldn't focus just on one particular task, but one single program that could do many tasks. So he let me see, I'm having problem advancing the slides.
There are problems with the slides.
Yeah, I'm having problem advancing the slide. Well, I can do it this way. So he introduced the concept of cognitive architecture, and that concept itself had broader roots in the computer field, originating with Fred Brooks, the inventor, effectively, of the concept of computer architecture, designing the IBM 360. And that emphasis in Newell's terms there in his 1990 book, The Unified Theories of Cognition, that he was focused on the fixed structures that form the framework for the processes of cognitive performance and learning. And of course, on top of that framework, there will be all sort of knowledge acquired and deployed and so on and so forth. But he was focused on the invariant structures of cognition. And obviously there, and the quote from Anderson below makes clear that there are different levels of abstraction in which one can do that. And that's also a concept that Newell introduced and explored through his concepts of the bands of cognition. The idea there that there are time scales that correspond to very different kinds of phenomena, but can also map to very different sort of levels of mechanism, from the biological band that is more directly concerned with the details of the brain and timescales in the milliseconds, to the cognitive band. That's really the band ultimately where a lot of cognitive architectures are situated, which are about the basic acts of cognition, in particular what he called the deliberate act level on the scale of 100 milliseconds. And as you go further and further up, you get to things like the rational band, which concerns more complex cognition, which potentially has modeling frameworks like Bayesian inference that are level above, all the way to the social bands and the evolution of knowledge and ideas. Now, it's potentially that concept of cognitive architecture is very difficult to evaluate. And Newell already recognized that and produced a list in his book that John Anderson and I expanded on in a BBS paper in 2003. And you can see that those were Newell's criteria for human cognitive architecture, not necessarily for an AI architecture, but he wanted to capture the full breadth of human cognition. You can see criteria there that go from behaving as an arbitrary function of the environment and operating in real time in the environment and exhibiting sort of rational adaptive behavior, behaving robustly in face of error and expected unknown, to integrating diverse knowledge, using vast amounts of knowledge, using natural language, learning from the environment, to higher level criteria like exhibiting self-awareness and a sense of self, acquiring capability through development or through evolution, and then finally, very much in reference to human cognition, be realizable within the brain. Those are very broad set of criteria compared, for example, with the Turing test, which focused on sort of one particular way of testing cognition. We evaluated those criteria for two of the approaches at the time, one of which was what we call classical connectionism, essentially the PDP approach of the 80s and 90s, and the other one was our ACTAR cognitive architecture at the time. The goal was not to determine which one was better or worse. The goal was rather to understand the strengths and weaknesses of those two very different approaches to human cognition and to point the way toward further progress, and then where the areas, the aspects of which progress was really most needed, and then potentially ways of combining the two approaches. And that's also something that the paper sort of went into some details in how constraints from the PDP framework actually guided the development of ACTAR. A few years ago, Kotsuruba and Tsotsos wrote a very thorough survey paper that they called 40 Years of Cognitive Architecture. And now essentially we're almost 50 years. And they did a fairly systematic review of cognitive architecture. So you see one of their graphs there about the list of cognitive architectures and the various sort of references that were made in them. And you can see, like everything else, there are some that are more popular than others, but the criteria was that all those cognitive architectures had to be implemented, sort of philosophical ideas did not count, and in at least some kind of broad use. And they had to be at some level of abstraction in the sense that neurocognitive architectures were okay, but purely neural architectures were seen as something that was sort of at a level of abstraction below the one they wanted to consider. So here's a timeline of cognitive architectures. The coding itself is interesting because it indicates the diversity there, where red refers to purely neural architectures, blue refers to hybrid architectures, and green refers to symbolic architectures. And they elaborated, and you can see that there are different phases at which some, for example, in the 80s, there were symbolic architectures turned out to have a period of popularity, whereas more recently, neural and hybrid architectures have come to dominate. And then they elaborate a taxonomy there of these architectures. And indeed, it's a very rich space in which, in particular, between the purely symbolic architectures and the purely sort of neural architecture, there is a rich space of different sort of hybrid architectures and different ways of integrating symbolic and neural aspects. And we ourselves have to have explored that space. Actar in of itself can be thought of as a hybrid architecture combining symbolic representation and neural-like statistical processes. But we're further exploring integrating it with other symbolic frameworks like task networks, or integrating it with purely neural cognitive architectures like the Libre architecture. So it's certainly a very rich and complex space to explore, and a lot of people have explored that space over the last 40 or 50 years. They go on to review the various components of these architectures. One of those is perception. All the way to robotics that Stephen mentioned, those constraints, going back to the Newell test, the constraints of being embodied in the world, that's a very powerful constraint. So for example, here they have various levels of thoroughness of integrating perception in the architecture. And you can see the architectures, and you'll see this for all the various capabilities, run the gamut, because developing a full architecture can be a very time-consuming and complex endeavor. So necessarily some architectures focused on some aspects more than others. Attention. I think in cognitive architectures, we don't believe that attention is all you need, but it's certainly a very important concept that is instantiated in different ways in various aspects, perceptual versus cognitive. Certainly working memory is an important aspect of that. And that there are different classes of mechanisms that can be implemented. So again, like everything in cognitive architecture, and we believe ultimately the understanding the human brain, it's quite a complex system, and there are a lot of different aspects to consider. Action selection, how the architecture goes and acts in the world and selects actions is also a fundamental aspect, ranging from systems that are primarily reactive to systems that have planning as a core concept. Action that goes from being completely deterministic to being probabilistic, and then various criteria on what guides action selection and how we learn sort of, rewards and utility, and we improve our effectiveness in the world. Memory is a particularly important aspect there, ranging from working memory to long-term memory, distinctions between semantic and episodic memories, procedural versus declarative memories, global memory, sensory memories, and so on and so forth. Again, it's a very rich space that many architectures, including Actar, have been centered around. Actar was originally purely a theory of memory. And certainly what distinguishes human cognition is the fact that we accumulate a very rich set of experiences over our lifetime that really constitute the basis for our behavior. Learning is usually seen as a primary constraint on cognitive architectures. A few don't emphasize it, but usually there is an assumption that knowledge should not be engineered, but rather should be learned, and then includes a range of learning mechanisms, from symbolic learning to statistical learning, learning declarative knowledge, learning procedural knowledge, and then various mechanisms for automatic learning that are inspired by reinforcement learning, Hebbian learning, error-driven learning, etc., etc. And those architectures have been applied to various domains, and different architectures had different focus, depending where they were coming from. Some architectures were coming from cognitive psychology, and there fitting human data is obviously a primary constraint, whereas other architectures were coming from AI, and therefore AI agents, playing games, virtual agents, cognitive robotics, robotic agents. Some architectures were coming more from a human performance, human factors perspective. They were applied then to the design of systems, to human-computer interactions. Some were focused on natural language processing as an important aspect. So you can see there that there is a really wide range, and I think very much from the perspective of the list of criteria in the Newell test, that testing architectures against a very broad range of human activity is an essential constraint. A few years ago, it occurred to a number of us that after decades of exploring the space, that a number of fundamental lessons had been learned, as you would expect and hope that happens with actual scientific progress, as opposed to the development of computer systems. So we wrote an article in AI magazine to try and popularize that idea. And what you can see there is an illustration of our respective cognitive architectures, ACTAR, SOAR, which was Newell's original architecture that now John Laird, one of Newell's students, is leading the development of, and Sigma, which is an architecture inspired by SOAR, but developed by Paul Rosenblum on concepts of semantic networks. And even though those architectures looked very different and used different vocabulary to describe their functions, it turns out that they very much converge to a similar view of the structure of cognition and some of the basic assumptions. And that's illustrated there in the graph on the top left of the principal modules and their relation. Going a little bit more in depth, we listed a detailed set of assumptions about the structure and processing that takes place in the architecture, the content of the memories, the forms of learning that takes place in the architecture, and the relation to perception and motor capabilities. A little bit of an exercise there on the left is that we coded the architectures and at various points in development, and in particular in 1993 and then 2016 when we started working on that paper. And we really concluded, you can see sort of a little multidimensional scaling exercise there at the bottom, that there had really been a convergence in that space of assumptions. So there can be two objections to this kind of things. Or the first one is that the graphic that I showed on the previous slide is basically our motherhood and apple pie. Yes, those modules are pretty obvious, and yes, they sort of interact that way. That's not not particularly interesting. And it turns out that's not quite the case. There is a bit more there that meets the eye. And so one of the things that we did, and one of my colleagues, Andrea Stocco, has led that effort, which is to take that structure of the common model that is shown there at the center, and to map it on the brain, the various structures of the human brain, and then use neuroimaging data as a way of validating that architecture. The mapping of the various modules on the brain had already been done, partly in the context of the cognitive architecture, but especially using techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging. So we could start with that mapping onto the brain, then apply statistical techniques like dynamic causal modeling to try and correlate neuroimaging data onto the activities of the modules. And then we evaluated the common model against a number of potential alternatives in the literature, variants of hierarchical organization and hub and spoke organizations. And we used the data from the Human Connectome database, which is a very large public database of high-quality neuroimaging data. We took a broad range of tasks from that database and evaluated the predictions using dynamic causal modeling of the common model structure against those alternative structures. And it turns out using a couple of standard measures, one is expected probability and the other is exceedance probability, it turns out that the patterns, the structure of the common model explain the temporal patterns, spatial patterns of activity of people doing those tasks much better than any of the competing proposals. And it turns out also we did a sensitivity analysis that showed that, yes, every component, it's not just a matter of having a more complex architecture. All the components, all the connections between the various modules were actually essential to that accounting. And sort of the second objection that can be made is that, okay, well, you get the structures, but what are we really telling me about the mechanisms? And you can take this a little bit further, and in particular, Andrea earlier had developed a fairly detailed model of the role of the basal ganglia, which is a structure of the base of the brain that's associated with the control of behavior, and it is mapped onto, in the common model, onto the procedural module that control our actions. So he had the detailed models of the internal structure of the basal ganglia and the various pathways. And he showed that what seems like a sort of a hopelessly symbolic constructs, right? Very good old-fashioned AI like production rules, what they actually do is specify pathways of testing and information transfer within that networks that implement the basal ganglia. So I think it's an important thing to realize that in modern cognitive architectures, that some of the what seems like old-fashioned paradigms like propositional representation or production rules and so forth can really be mapped in a meaningful way onto the processes of the brain, and that they basically an abstract way of describing those structures. So this was my introduction to cognitive architectures. And you can see that they have some aspects in common with generative models, but also important differences. So that raised the potential topic of trying to integrate the two approaches. And we issued a call proposal for a AAAI Fall Symposium last year, which we found. We also had a couple of symposia to discuss the common model, and we found that generally to be a good forum for engaging the community. So we had a number of potential ideas and topics for which the approaches that could be taken. We have received a fairly rich set of submissions. So that's the first day. That's the program of the first day, and we'll go through that program, and I'll highlight some of the talks to try and illustrate the various ways in which those two concepts can be combined. John Laird gave an introduction where he pointed out the complementary strengths of weaknesses of the two concepts. So, for example, that cognitive architectures are distinguished by the complexity of those various modules and mechanisms and their learning mechanisms, whereas large language models effectively lack much of that complexity or that capability for online learning, for example, or various mechanisms for reasoning. Conversely, large language models are able to store quite amazing body of knowledge and show amazing fluency at using language to access that knowledge, so that knowledge aspect has something that's always been sort of neglected in cognitive architectures and language as well to some extent. So there was a natural complementarity there that supported the desire to try and combine them. So the lead talk was by Oscar Romero here at Carnegie Mellon, and they explored various ways of combining cognitive architectures and large language models. Their use case was a cell phone-based cognitive agent for visually impaired assistants. So that was sort of a way of grounding the kind of capabilities that they wanted to explore. So they illustrate there on the right a number of modular approaches. So for example, on the top left, you could use cognitive architectures as a way of essentially reason in a chain of thought LLM prompting. Or you can embed the large language models in various modules of the architecture. For example, on the top right, the perceptual motor modules, or on the bottom left, also the memory modules, which are the stores of knowledge. And finally, you can use the large language model essentially for an internal simulation there, sort of a world model to drive cognitive architectures. And you can see here, as was the case, as was evident in the structure of the common model, that working memory really plays a central role, and that's going to be, I think, a common aspect of a lot of these integrations. Other approaches, so they essentially had a neurosymbolic approach where generative models correspond to essentially an internal implementation level. So for example, on the top right there was a version of the Clarion architecture where the connectionist level takes the form of an LLM. And finally, on the bottom right, there's a couple different grain scales at which to combine cognitive architectures and large language models essentially as agents in a diverse society of mind type where the two different kinds of agents have different capabilities and can sort of combine their judgments. So we tried to go through the various sessions and to some extent increasing order of depth of integration. So the first session there that we called offline integration / content is about using large language models as for the store of knowledge that they really are, and in particular using them to generate a knowledge database offline that can then be used by the cognitive architecture. So one example talk about this was by a number of colleagues at Ohio State and the Air Force Research Lab, where they took an actor model of analogy that would perform various aspects of analogy, like retrieval of knowledge and mapping and abstraction, generalization. And obviously in those models, again, the knowledge engineering is the bottleneck because cognitive architectures historically have not focused on knowledge. So they use the large language models to extract chunks in the form of subject relation object triples, as well as other things like sentiment and confidence scores. Then filtered those triples, and that was a particular domain of sports, and then the knowledge base was Wikipedia, and used the LLM to filter that external knowledge store, and then represent those pieces of information, and then deploy the analogy reasoning model and evaluate its capabilities. So that's sort of the low-hanging fruit there of using large language models for offline knowledge extraction. The next step in ambition is to use them in the same way for knowledge extraction, but in an online interactive way. Similar domain of analogy, Forbes and collaborator described the use of large language models in their companion cognitive architecture, where they had a rule-based semantic parser based on various ontologies like FrameNet and Psych. And then they augmented it with an older version of large language model, BERT, to augment the analogy process, and in particular to classify the frames for disambiguation and predict the plausibility of facts. And they have a number of other uses that they were planning to push that further. Another instance of knowledge acquisition by John Laird and colleagues was to use large language models as a source of knowledge, but for interacting cognitive agents interacting with an embodied environment. And you can see a representation there in the top right in terms of a simple robot. Again, there are different levels of knowledge extraction that can be done, from indirect extraction of knowledge graphs to direct extraction of task knowledge, which is what they focused on, potentially all the way to direct knowledge encoding, i.e. have the LLM generate a program for the cognitive architecture. And there was another talk in the symposium that took that approach. They go on fairly systematically at evaluating the challenges of that kind of knowledge and also the requirements of that knowledge. And then they ran a test. They had procedures, essentially pipelines for prompting the large language models, interpreting, testing, and verifying the knowledge generating, then encoding and applying and refining it in that domain. And on the bottom right is a classification of the knowledge that was extracted. And then you can see that it runs a wide range from very relevant and reasonable all the way to uninterpretable. So I think that's going to be obviously, there have been some concern about confabulation on the part of large language models, and certainly filtering the knowledge generated before it's used in the cognitive architecture, or using the mechanism of the cognitive architecture to determine which knowledge extracted from generative models is reliable and relevant is obviously very much a part of that. Going further in depth, there were a number of talks that looked at integrating generative models for more basic functions than just supplying knowledge. So one of them suggesting the need for an additional level in cognitive architectures that they call middle memory, which would effectively be used to resolve the potential conflicts between the bottom-up vectors being generated by those generative models to the top-down task context and symbolic structures used by the cognitive architecture. And again, there the concept of providing an attentional context in order to put those two systems together. Another proposal by Mike Whitbrock and colleagues was what they call the language model based cognitive architecture. There was a bit of their integration similar to the distinction of system 1 and system 2, with you can think of generative models in the Kahneman dichotomy as basic automatic systems that just take their inputs and filter them through the answer. Whereas you can think of cognitive architectures as more of a system 2 type system that can reason, that has iterative processing and planning and those kind of things. But they viewed language as the integrative framework for those two kinds of systems. And they posit various kinds of long-term memories to perform that integration and leverage the concept of buffer, that is a central concept of the common model, that is the interface between the various modules that constitute working memory. And they discuss various ways of augmenting pre-trained modules to integrate them in the cognitive architecture. And finally, the last session was sort of more ambitious or more diverse way of looking at the integration or the unifications of generative model and cognitive architectures. In particular, there were a couple talks by O'Rourke and Kelly and Furlong and Ilya Smith that proposed a unification of the two paradigms. The first talk was through concepts of Hebbian learning and free energy that Carl Friston talked about. The second one through vector symbolic algebra. So basically to bridge the gap, fully bridge the gap between neural and symbolic representation and processes. A couple other talks that we will look at here was the talk by Gonzalez and colleagues about using generative models to generate a representation to use in the cognitive architectures, and in particular in the modeling paradigm called instance-based learning, which bases decisions on experiences. And they evaluated 3 different kinds of generative models on the ability to generate that situation representation and the kind of performance that would result in the cognitive model. Finally, there was a paper by Brian McGurko and colleagues that looked at a cognitive perspective on grounding, a topic near and dear to this symposium. And they differentiated various kinds of grounding: sensory, motor, communicative, epistemic, relational, and referential groundings, and showed in some examples on the right how those concepts of grounding could be instantiated in the integration between generative models and cognitive architecture. And then they went into some broader issues of generative models like alignment and intractability, and again looked at how cognitive architectures could provide part of the solution. There were a number of posters as well. Then there was a wrap-up session, and I sort of put in my own thoughts there. And what occurred to me after going through the symposium, that in as much as we started with the conception that cognitive architectures and generative model were really mirror opposite in their strengths and weaknesses, there was certainly also a sense in which they shared a surprising number of assumptions. So, for example, the central concept of attention in generative models, especially in transformers, is quite similar to the central concept of working memory in cognitive architectures. Similarly, the token versus vector duality is quite similar to the symbolic, sub-symbolic distinction in cognitive architectures. Both paradigms have a probabilistic softmax behavior. They can both be tuned through reinforcement learning. The time scale of generative models, especially large language models, in terms of generating the next word, is very much the time scale of the deliberate act level. That is so in the neural bands of cognition, which seems to be where the cognitive architectures have focused and where the common model is situated. And the loop there of always sort of producing the next word and then iterating on that is similar to some of the assumptions of sequential processing that are assumed in the common model. And even that's the concept of prompting is not that dissimilar to the interaction between the central procedural module with the various modules of the architecture, such as accessing knowledge or encoding a particular percept. Now, there's certainly aspects of differences as well. I mean, you can sort of think of the current state of generative models as sort of the behaviorist stage in psychology before the emergence of the cognitivism and the assumptions of internal mechanisms and structures. The fact that large language models have to be pre-trained in a batch mode as opposed to the kind of continuous online learning of cognitive systems is a major difference. And the fact also that they by and large lack the kind of internal control that is essential to making a complex modular cognitive architecture operate is also a major difference. We laid out a bit of a roadmap for future potential interaction between the two. I mean, certainly it seems that 50 years of cognitive architectures have explored the space of complex human-level cognitive systems. And that's something that as AI is looking at augmenting the capabilities of generative models should be of interest. It certainly seems that modular integration was the low-hanging fruit in terms of building complex systems that includes generative models and cognitive architectures in whole or part as components of the system. And then finally, it seems fairly clear that cognitive science, in as much as it's been preoccupied for over a century with evaluating the human cognitive system, should also have a lot to say as an evaluation framework for generative models. And finally, I'll leave you there with pointers to a couple references. So there is a website / online journal called the Common Model of Cognition Bulletin, where you can read a lot of papers associated with the common model of cognition. And then on the right is the proceeding of the AAAI Fall Symposium, where almost all of the papers were published online. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. And now your discussant, your fellow Carnegie Mellon graduate, Thierry Lebiere, will speak. Could you remove your, oh, that's yours.
There you go. Thanks, Christian. So I have questions, and that I'd love to get your feedback on, drawing on some of the slides that you presented in the enterprise more generally. So this idea of bands of ignition, I think, is super useful for, if for nothing else, for kind of realizing that there are often qualitatively different processes at work at different timescales. On the other hand, it seems like this sort of framework encourages people to sort of specialize in timescales, much in the same way that Newell critiqued cognitive psychology research at the time for specializing in tasks and not integrating across tasks. And so the first question is, it seems clear that what happens at the cognitive band is informed by what happens on the social time scale. So, for example, things like written systems, notations, a lot of our, our cognitive chunks, the kind of concepts, are the products of cultures. They're not reinvented by individuals in the moment, and cognitive operations happening on the time scale of seconds are being informed by things that happened at these much longer time scales. So that's one question. So what in your view is the connection? How is it best modeled within the cognitive architectures approach? And then the other questions stem from this, by the way, for anyone who's not read this paper, you should. It's a wonderful paper. It's a great snapshot of the kinds of questions that people were interested in the 70s, and many of these questions are still ones that people are taking kind of an active interest in this sort of dichotomous way, which just goes to make Newell's point. And there are many ways of reading this paper, even if you're not compelled by the cognitive architectures approach, you will learn a lot from reading this paper. Okay, but I wanted to focus on this Newell test that Christian discussed, specifically these four. And so I have a question for each. So first being use of natural language. And so for all of these, Christian, these are obviously your takes on the issue. I'm not expecting kind of the ground truth answer. Just I'd love to know how you think of it. So what, in your view, is the proper place for natural language in cognitive architectures? Obviously, for number 9, learning from one's environment is key. If you have a model of cognition that doesn't incorporate learning from your environment, you're obviously missing something. But what kinds of learning do you think are currently missing or not modeled to your satisfaction that you think we should be focusing on? And then relatedly, 10, acquiring capabilities through development. I mean, that learning is part of development. But a question I have is what sort of assumptions do you take as good starting points about the starting points for a cognitive system? So what kinds of things do you feel compelled to try to explain the development of versus things that you're comfortable saying, well, we might want to explain how they evolved biologically, but we can take, some sort of core system, core knowledge system, some set of basic learning abilities, basic perceptual abilities, what have you, as the starting point, and I don't need to explain the development of that. And then lastly, evolution. What in your views in most need of explanation here? So the evolution of what? Those are my questions. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much. Could you go back to, could we take the slides in order? That's great. So that first concern about sort of the various levels and the possibility to pick and choose between those various levels. I mean, first of all, I think that's probably unavoidable, right? So like by analogy to the physical world, there is physics and there is chemistry and there is biology and there is social sciences, and they look at, you know, phenomena that are that they focus on and in fair isolation, because those are so different and they're so rich but they are grounded in each other, right? So social systems are grounded in biology, biology is grounded into chemistry, chemistry is grounded into physics. So I think that the challenge here is not to sort of pick and choose the right level, but rather to have a description of the phenomena at each level that are grounded, sort of, you know, turtles all the way down. So I think that that's the challenge for the field, to be able to relate the various paradigms that have arisen at each level. So for example, sort of neural level models, cognitive models, more rational level models that I would put, for example, Bayesian inference in, and so on and so forth, to relate them to each other, not to view them as separate and competing paradigms. That said, we made the argument in the 1998 book that I co-authored with John Anderson, that was titled The Atomic Components of Thought, that there is a special, in that complexity hierarchy, that there is a special sort of favored atomic level. And again, sort of making the analogy to the physical world, sort of atoms is that privileged level on which our world is built. Below that is the soup of particles that sort of gather at that level. But then above that is the combinatorial buildings of molecules and increasingly complex system through chemistry and biology and all that. And that seems to be a general property of complex systems. So they call that the hourglass diagram, where you sort of, or the bow tie, the vertical bow tie, if you will. So to take another example, the internet. And you can see in the internet, sort of the TCP/IP level is the central level there. Below that, you have a lot of different hardware implementations of that and different sub-levels. Above that, you have more and more complex protocols like HTTP and so on and so forth being built. But that's really the core level. So there is interesting argument there about the nature of complex systems and the sort of the primacy of one particular level. Certainly for cognitive architectures, that deliberate act level, that's one of the key assumptions of the common model. And that seems to be something that has been learned. And interestingly enough, the original version of ACTAR, when I got involved with it in the early 90s, was situated as a substantially higher level within the cognitive band. You had production rules that could accomplish seconds or even tens of seconds of cognition. They were really at the unit task level. And we learned, partly again, applying neural constraints of, what kind of constructs at that level could even be plausibly implemented using stock neural constraints at the time, like Hopfield networks. And it became clear that a lot of them could not. And that's what we sort of threw out and simplified at the symbolic level and really focused on. And one implication of that was to break it down from the unit task level to that deliberate act level that seemed to correspond to the core processes in the various modules. And then once you had broken it down, you had an adaptive system that could operate sort of much more much more naturally, much more adaptively, much more flexibly. So that's sort of that evolution there. And it's interesting that different cognitive architectures seem like so, for example, which came from very different paths. So Newell was on the computer science side of things. Herb Simon, John Anderson here were on the psychology side. So the cognitive architectures certainly came from very different perspective, but they seem to have converged to that sort of common understanding of the right place of the complexity. Again, not to deny that you cannot have models at different levels, but that seemed to be a privileged level there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So first of all, I should say you were very kind here to focus on those, because looking, for example, at number 4, use vast amounts of knowledge about the environment. We rated classical connectionists as worse. Certainly, looking at where generative models are now, there's been a remarkable evolution. We're obviously the top of the heap and just incredibly capable in that respect. So, let's chalk that up to evolution. Again, we were not trying to necessarily score points rather than sort of take our perspective on where things were at the time. The proper place of natural language is an interesting one, right? So it's a fundamental conundrum in cognitive science of whether language underlies symbolic thought or vice versa. I don't have a strong opinion about that. I tend to be of the general assumption that seems to be the sort of how things have evolved in cognitive architectures, that symbolic processing and all the various sort of underlying statistical and neural-like processes that can underlie symbolic processing come first, and then language is sort of a capability on top of that. And there've been some very impressive models of language built on that. Like, for example, Rick Lewis had a very, very interesting model showing how constraints on the speed of cognitive processing and limitations of working memory led to various patterns in language production. So that's the take that I think is the default take in cognitive architecture, and that's sort of my default take as well. In general, I've been very mindful of the complexities of language, and that's something that can sort of absorb your entire career. So I've largely stayed away from that, but I just taking the language take on development, for example. So there've been some interesting models, in particular contrasting sort of PDP versus cognitive architecture models of the learning of past tense, right? And the patterns like over-regularization through development and so on. So I think that language is actually a good dimension, a good phenomenon to look at development. We've never quite sort of come up with that idea that you express of a core system from that point of view. Like, right, what are the original production rules through which everything can be built? I think that's it's been challenging to try and come up. Neil Stadgen has developed a related framework called PRIMS, in which he looks at those kind of issues. So, but another take on development that another potential approach that we raise is the change of cognitive capacity parameters with development. So, for example, the parameter in the ACTA cognitive architecture that controls spreading activation has been associated with working memory capacity, and that's something that there's suggestions that capacity increases through development. So that's another potential take at development. What kind of learning are currently missing? So I think that cognitive architectures generally have a fairly good take on both sort of the acquisition of knowledge and the strengthening and decay and forgetting of knowledge. Similarly, for the development of skills represented as procedural knowledge. One kind of learning that has been missing and I'm currently working on is what the connection is called hard learning, which is the learning of the representation inside the network, what was used to be called the hidden units. And the correspondence of those representations that are learned in a cognitive architecture like ACTAR is in terms of similarities between concepts, which you can sort of imagine abstractions of the overlap between distributed representations, so whether cosine similarity or distance. And that's the kind of that's one form of learning that I'm currently working on is can similarities between symbolic concepts be learned within the cognitive architecture? So the final one, evolution. So what is meant there is the evolution of the human cognitive architecture through entire evolutionary history. And looking at the sort of the current picture of the cognitive architecture of the common model, it certainly is the case that some capabilities developed later than others. And there's some indications from evolutionary biology of the path that was followed. And I'm surprised that people have not played more the kind of games of saying, oh, okay, well, if you remove sort of the goal buffer and the intentional module from the cognitive architecture, what kind of behavior can you have without that? Or if you remove declarative memory, or if you, in various ways, sort of limit their capabilities, either parametrically or otherwise, what kind of, and does that map to sort of the capabilities along the evolutionary path that led to humans? I think cognitive architectures provide a potential way to do those kind of explorations computationally. And again, I'm surprised that more people haven't tried to do that, because that seems like a natural thing to do.
So related to this, one can also imagine trying, you're an animal with the kind of brain that it has, and it has to do something, right? And it has to do it with the brain body that it has. And so kind of these natural constraints, right? And animals find all sorts of ingenious solutions to these natural problems, right? Where one might a priori think that, oh no, you could not possibly solve this kind of problem with this kind of system, and yet often nature finds ways. So a kind of flipping it around a bit. So in the case of neural networks, this the sorts of systems I'm most familiar with, right? One can limit it in various ways and train it on a task and see what kinds of representations it learns, given the set of limitations that you get, right? Whether it's architecture, the types of inputs that it's getting, to see, is, right, are there parts of the solution space that can be exploited that one might not have believed existed?
No, that's right. And again, I think people who use cognitive architectures have been very focused on sort of, reaching the human level, and potentially even some things that I've done for sort of practical application purposes, to say, well, what happens if we relax some of these constraints or parameters, like the constraints on working memory, and you essentially have a little bit of a superhuman architecture there. And that's certainly been very, very useful and interesting. If you don't mind going back to the first slide, I realized that I forgot to answer one of your questions, is the connection between the cognitive and the social level. So one interesting assumption there with the social level is that Newell sort of put it at the time scale of days to months or even higher, which is certainly fine, because that was the grain scale at which sort of social phenomena happened back then. Of course, in the last few decades, there's been the technology of social networks, which bring those kind of phenomena down to the rational and even down to the cognitive bands, right? I mean, things happen on Twitter/X in seconds to minutes, and you have a very large number of people being exposed to an idea or something, and then aggregating, reacting to it, responding to it, elaborating, to rating, and so on and so forth. And you have the kind of social phenomena that would take days and weeks and months and years before that takes place within seconds or minutes. Does that fundamentally change the nature of those social phenomena? I think that's a good question. But certainly something that a number of us have been doing more recently is to use cognitive models of individuals, which has always been the focus of cognitive psychology, and try to apply it to social phenomena. What happens when you put thousands or hundreds of thousands of cognitive models together and they decide how to propagate ideas and concepts over social networks? And I think there's potentially a lot of very useful things that could be done with cognitive models and cognitive architectures in social science and social psychology, because I think the computational means are there to scale up from the historical focus on individual cognition to social scale cognition.
Great. Thank you so much. Oh, let's take.
Okay, thanks, Gary and Christian, for this very good CMU to CMU interaction. I've elevated a few people from the attendees to the panelists so that they've made comments before, so they can make them. There are no spontaneous comments right now among the attendees, but for example, Anna Strasser, Julia Zimmerman, Robert Liu, and David Pulizotto are invited to speak if you want. I've given you the capacity to do it. And one second, I'm muting you now. And panelists, of course. Yeah, Julia, go ahead.
Hello, thanks for the talk. So I was wondering, on one of your slides, you noted a connection between tokens and vectors on the one hand and the symbolic and subsymbolic representations on the other. Could you explain a little bit more about how the vector could be analogous to the subsymbolic level?
Yes, so one direction. So as my bio mentioned, I was a connectionist researcher in the 80s in my grad school days, and I describe myself as a recovering connectionist. So one of the things I've been trying to do within the context of the ACTA cognitive architecture is to try and abstract some of the key and unique and extremely important characteristics of neural networks and connectionist models into a cognitive architecture like ACTA, which is grounded at the symbolic level in symbolic representations. And one of the approaches that we took was really through that concept of similarity, which one of the previous speakers mentioned the importance of similarities and differences in guiding generalization. So the idea there is not to represent sort of the specific distributed representation that are learned in connectionist networks or in generative models that drive generalization and inference, but rather to abstract them in the concept of similarity, which is essentially sort of the distance by one metric or another between those representations. And then have mechanisms like partial matching, another mechanism called blending, which are ways of using those similarities to get the kind of generalization processes that are typical of connectionist models and distributed representations at the symbolic level. So I think those have been quite successful for accounting both of the power of similarity-based generalization in human behavior, as well as the kind of errors, for example, that can be caused by that. And as I mentioned, my current focus is to try and abstract the mechanism by which those representations, those distributed representations, are learned by connectionist algorithms, and find a way to learn those representations, learn those similarities directly in the cognitive architecture, rather than have to depend to import them from neuroimaging studies or generative models, as one of the talk at the symposium described.
Alina, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have a clarification question. So is there a fundamental difference between cognitive and behavioral models, or they can be modeled using the architectures that you described, mostly about cognitive models? I'm asking because I'm interested in planning, and I plan to measure planning via behavior. But I plan to model that behavior using mostly cognitive models. So, yeah, interesting how you can use those for behavioral data.
So I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question. So it's the difference between cognitive models and
behavioral models. So how the cognition, for example, planning, how it's represented in behavior. So can the same models be used?
So I'm not sure what example of behavioral models you have in mind. Certainly, so one of the key neural criteria is interacting with the task, interacting with the world. So we've gone a long way from sort of the brain in a box that would sort of think about some abstract problems and come up with a solution, to models that act in the world, whether that's a sort of cognitive robotics model actually implemented of robotic platform, versus models interacting with simulated task environments. So for example, interacting with psychology experiments in exactly the same way that a subject sitting in a psychology experiment would do, which is to pass the screen and typically type responses using keyboard or mouse or whatever. So they very much, those cognitive models are very much behavioral model, in the sense that the cognition comes out in terms of behavior in the world. Have I answered your question? So again, I'm not sure that I completely understood it.
Yes, I think so. Your last sentence, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alina. This is the last chance for the panelists who've watched. Yes, okay, Anna, go ahead. Anna?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So I repeat my question. I would love to pose a question about the knowledge acquisition you reported from, and especially about the procedure of testing and verifying. So if you're using generative models, you of course know that the outputs are not reliable. And I would be very curious to hear about what kind of procedures one can apply to verify and test outputs, because it is a dangerous thing to get 40 outputs into a nice ACT-R model.
Yeah, so I think so the answer depends obviously what task you're doing and what kind of embodiment you're assuming. So for example, in the kind of environment in which that was mentioned, so the Lebiere et al. Paper there that sort of imagined a robotic environment, you could imagine the testing of verifying being of the form, I've asked the large language models on how to do that task, and it's given me a series of steps to do that, I could just do them, right? And figure out, okay, does it work? And if it doesn't work, then you can either reason about it and strike out that knowledge, or you can depend on learning mechanism to, for example, adjust the utility of these pieces of knowledge and say, well, that usually doesn't work, right? That has a low utility. You could imagine before doing that, engaging in some reasoning and try, for example, based on your other knowledge, to try and figure out, well, is it possible that it would work, or is there some particular issue with that? Can I, for example, mentally simulate the steps that are proposed and find some discrepancy? So that's often what you do, for example, when you gave some of those typical puzzles to ChatGPT or whatever, and you read the steps and you check, oh, is this solution plausible, right? Or is it misunderstanding, or are there some steps that are impossible? So it depends on the specifics of being able to do the testing and verifying, depends on the knowledge available, depends on the ability to test it in the world or whatever environment you embodied in. Any kind of form of reasoning by analogy. I mentioned one of the approaches to extracting knowledge, use sort of ratings of plausibility to do that knowledge filtering. So I don't think that there is sort of a simple, easy solution in many ways. So we live in a world now where we, as sort of human beings, are exposed to a bewildering array of sources of information through the internet, especially. And we have to decide there whether the information that we received in a particular context is credible or not, and to try and apply critical thinking to gauge its plausibility and its accuracy against sort of everything else that we know. So that's certainly not something that happens magically, automatically. It's a painstaking process. It's a difficult process to apply that kind of consistency judgments. I think it's a very complex process, and there's not a single answer to that.
Okay, last question from the panel, not from the panel, from the attendees. Anonymous asks, regarding the view that cognitive structures for symbolic processing precede and provide a basis for language ability, how do LLMs fit or change it? LLMs use a subsymbolic vector-based processing to model language first, and we are still figuring out how to get them to be better at tasks involving symbolic reasoning, as many talks, including the last one, have shown.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly what the question is or what I can add to my previous comments. I mean, it certainly is the case. I mean, the first thing that happens in large language models is the tokenizing. So it takes that language and extract tokens, which you can think of as symbols, and then so the vector level applies, and the representations for those tokens are learned. So in that sense, you could say as well that the symbolic precedes the sort of the language there in that way, or at least the development of the semantics of the language. Yeah, I think the relation between the two is certainly very complex. And I mean, one of the talk by Whitbrock and colleagues at the symposium proposed making language essentially the grounding representation in cognitive architecture. So to organize cognitive architectures around language rather than symbols. So that certainly is an interesting possibility to be explored.
Chaim Dubosavsky will be speaking in a couple of days, on language change, and I would say that saying language is the grounding of language is about, it's really gone a long distance. But anyway, that's it for the questions. I want to thank you very much. And Michael Levin's talk will be starting at 1:30. You have a little bit more time for lunch now. Thank you very much for